what I would like to do tonight, I would like to introduce you to our speakers, Jeff and Shanti Feldhans.
Thanks, Matt and Angel. I hope we can live up to all of this.
Seriously, I'm not
wow.
sure we can live up to that introduction. Thank you, guys.
Really. Let's jump in real quick here and tell you kind of what this talk is not going to be about.
Yes,
because I think that'll be helpful.
Yes, because some people are probably like, I'm leaving now because of the topic.
And if you're thinking it's going to be about numbers and budgeting and expenses,
it is not.
Excel spreadsheets, it's not. I mean, one is you really don't want us advising you.
You really don't
on that at all. Seriously,
you don't want us helping you with your budget. I promise. There are some people in this space right now, probably online, who are very gifted at it and are facilitators of the stewardship ministry and are wonderful, and we should probably talk to you. However, what we were studying in this isn't how do you have a great budget, but how do you have a great relationship around money?
And why does money seem to push all those buttons within us and get us sideways? So that's what we looked at, and how to avoid having all of those buttons pushed.
And we should tell you just really briefly how this started, because this is not a topic we would have ever chosen. We actually, in 2017, we were in a place where it was actually really difficult because all of our research projects are pretty expensive and require a fairly large investment of not just time, but a lot of money to do the research right. And the publishing industry has changed so much that the economics just didn't work the same way. And we were thinking, are we ever going to be able to do a research project again? Lord, do you want us to continue to do research to help relationships? And really praying about that, and a little bit anguished, actually, as to whether or not the season had passed for our ministry. And out of the blue, we got a call from a financial services company that tends to serve Christians. And they said, we had really never heard of them, never worked with them, and they're very missional. And they said, we wanted to talk to you guys. We know you all are researchers, and we have seen as a financial services company that money is one of the big issues in marriage. It's one of the things that causes arguments.
And the most devastating financial event that an individual can encounter, usually in their life, is divorce.
The most devastating thing financially. And they said, money can be a really big issue in marriage. We don't think it has to be. And they said to us, how would you feel about making this your next research project and us funding it? And of course, instantly we were like, oh my gosh, are you kidding, Lord? That's amazing. And then about 10 seconds later,
oh my gosh. Really?
And oh no, because this meant that we were actually going to have to dig into this, because this was the one topic that in our marriage, after now almost 27 years,
and
Mark and Melissa, I see you. We have the same history.
And 16 years of research.
And 16, 17 years of research.
On what makes for happy marriages and good relationships.
And we had done pretty well at applying it. And this was the issue that we were still not on the same page.
And it wasn't that we fought about it. And I think this is probably common with most folks who are watching right now. You don't necessarily have knockdown, drag out fights about it. Some may, but what really happens is we just kind of learned how to manage around it, to cope in our marriage around this issue. We just kind of didn't talk about it. We learned how to get through our life and budgets and all of those sorts of things by not talking about it directly.
Interestingly, we have over the last 3 years, we spent about 3 years on this project. Mm-hmm. And we have identified really briefly for you, what are the key things that will change all of that? Yeah. What are the key things that tend to get in the way of the relationship? And so we're going to just jump in to what these issues are. And I'm going to share my screen really quickly, just so that we have a couple of different slides that we're going to pull up and kind of go through as part of this conversation. And we'll go through this quickly, and then we're going to pause and we'll do a Q&A at the end, as long as that's still okay with Mark and Meliza and Pastors Matt and Angel. Yeah. Okay, cool. So basically, here's kind of the starting point. The research was sponsored by this company called Thrivent, and we should let you know that everything we're going to say from this point on is based on this
nationally representative survey of what was it, 1,000?
3,500 people, I think, ish, somewhere in there, 3,600, something like that. In order to be able to tell you what works, what doesn't work, what are the issues, what are the obstacles, and what are those little things that are going to make a big difference for you. Now, that said, we should say we're going to be making generalizations here.
And everyone is an individual. If as Shanti often says, if 75% of the people in the research said one thing, well, then 25% said the other. So, it's just to give you a good starting point and try to think where you or your spouse might fall on it.
So here's a suggestion. Get out one of these, get out a pen, take a couple of notes. And yes, Mark is like, yes, I've got my paper, I've got my pen. Get a pen and actually take some notes on what are the things that apply to you that we're saying? What are the things that might apply to your spouse? And then you can actually trade and have a conversation afterwards. And we'll give you a couple little conversation starters as we go. Okay, we're going to talk about the problem that we all face. What's the sort of big picture solution? And then we'll get into some of the details about how do you apply it? What are some of the little individual things, the practical things that you need to do? The biggest problem is that we all want a really great relationship around money, but 92% of us have some tension. That is just the reality right now. Most people are sort of, okay, like Jeff said, but they kind of manage around it sometimes. And they don't necessarily know how to have that abundant, thriving relationship in this area, particularly that God has promised us. This money should not be an area that's like the third rail for relationships. It's supposed to be something that is actually a source of connection rather than conflict.
Well, one of the things that was interesting to us is that honestly, even folks who have made wise financial decisions and have a surplus or margin in their financial life, if you still have certain feelings about money and how it should work, and your spouse perhaps has a different approach than you,
different feelings about how it should work.
It doesn't matter how much money you have, it could steal your joy in your relationship. So learning those little things of how we're different, why we're different, and how to kind of work with those differences will make all the difference.
All the difference. And by the way, we're not going to do it in this event because this is just for married couples. But when we do these events that include singles, and for those of you who have adult children, this is something every single understands. Sitting down at dinner with a date, looking across the table and going, why do you have so many student loans? Or how do you handle money? This is a big deal for people to understand early, if any of you have adult children. Okay, so here's the biggest issue. The greatest obstacle to doing money well, it turns out, is the ability for the husband and wife to sit down at the kitchen table and talk about money. It turns out that, believe it or not, only 23% of couples can do that well. 77% of couples have this kind of avoidance or frustration or just kind of wanting to do what you want to do and sort of not coming together around it. And here's what we found as we sort of went along is that the big picture solution for this is a little bit different than maybe what we've thought before in the past. As a big picture solution, it is very easy for a stewardship ministry or a financial planner, Dave Ramsey courses, for you guys, because I think Mark and Meliza and Matt and Angel, you guys have a stewardship ministry at Victory. You put a lot of time and energy into that, which is awesome. But there tends to be a focus on building cushion and building margin and saving more than you spend, which is, of course, extremely important. And we found that that is actually protective of the relationship. That isn't just good financially, that's good relationally. Because if you have margin, you're not as thrown when something happens.
The car breaks down.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The car breaks down and you don't start arguing about it because you have a little bit of margin. The problem is it's not the ending point. And that tends to be where most of us focus is the technical stuff. How do you have a great budget? How do you build the cushion? How do you get out of debt? All of that is good. But in order to do that, for 77% of couples, something else has to happen first. You have to be able to talk about money in order to be able to come together and reach agreement and budget and do all those things to begin with in order to build that cushion that is protective of the relationship.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
The talk about money thing, it sounds great. And usually counselors will always say that talking about something is the cure.
Solution. Yes.
And the problem for me as a guy is that I don't really know what's going on all the time inside of me so that I can talk about it. I can feel these things, but the ability to be able to then articulate it, I know I'm angry or upset, but exactly defining why is a challenge.
Yeah.
And why I'm upset with you.
Well, and it's not just as a guy. I mean, this is something that's really common. Like, Mark and Meliza, you were talking about how Mark gets to the store and doesn't use the coupons because he's forgotten them. And that's one of those things that, like, I've heard the spouse say, why doesn't he just use the coupons? Or why doesn't she just use the coupons or whatever? And you can't necessarily articulate that. And so here's what we found is the solution under the solution, which is that in order to do both of those things, there is a crucial first step that has to happen, which is to understand what's going on inside of you and understand what is going on inside of your partner, to be able to have those conversations and build cushion and create that good financial, healthy, technical stuff under the surface. So what we're going to talk about for the rest of this is what are those things that we tend not to get underneath the surface.
So you can understand yourself. You don't even get about yourself, or let alone your
spouse. Here's the big picture truth that we found that is, if you write this down and you remember nothing else, just remember this one thing from tonight. Write it down, stick it on your mirror. When you have tension about money, it turns out it's not about the money. It turns out it's about how money makes us feel and how it makes our spouse feel, and about a host of expectations about how money should work. Like, of course, you're just supposed to use coupons. That's just the way it works. How money should work, all these insecurities that are running under the surface that we don't know are there, these beliefs from our childhood, all sorts of things that are inside.
Well, the interesting thing is, as you're describing that, for me in particular, all of those thoughts just feel so right and natural. Everybody knows that this is how you handle money. It's like the law of gravity. It's just that way.
It is.
And when we got married, and she had a very different way of approaching these things. And of course, I didn't understand it. And I just kind of put it in a bucket of Shanti has a character flaw. Now, that probably isn't a good thing to say out loud in your relationship. And so I kept it to myself until we were doing this research. But that was really part of the narrative that was running through my mind.
Let me give them an example. So one of the things, and this is a classic little example, but it's of those little examples that these arguments really kind of catalyze, right? Mm. And so silly example, but suppose it's been a long day of meetings and I'm driving home from a bunch of meetings and I call Jeff and I say, you know what, we've all been really busy. How about I just pick up some Chinese food for the family for dinner? Jeff will be the one who tends to go, you know what, that's going to be like $35 or $40. And, we have some chicken in the fridge from Costco. Why don't we just grill the chicken?
And I'll do it.
And you'll do it. And okay, so here's the question. Why does that bug me?
And why does her phone call asking about the Chinese food bug me?
And we wouldn't have been able to articulate it. But here's what you do now when that happens is you stop and you think to yourself, okay, this is not about the money. This isn't about the $35 or $40. This is about something else. I know it seems like it's about that money, but it's not. What's it about? And so we wouldn't have been able to articulate that until this research, but we realized that for me, I'm thinking subconsciously that, we've been so busy. The kids have had all these activities and our daughter's been doing the volleyball games and our son is doing track and we haven't seen each other. And if we grill the chicken, Jeff, sure, he'll be doing the grilling, but there's going to be prep and then we're going to be eating it. And then there's cleanup and pretty soon, it's going to be time for homework. And so I'm like, $35 to buy this precious hour of family time? Absolutely. That's what's in my head.
And what's in my head is, are you kidding me? I mean, if we just keep spending for Chinese food on every whim that we want, we're going to get to retirement and there's going to be nothing there. We're going to be homeless. So now you see the dilemma.
Both of these things are running under the surface and we wouldn't have been able to articulate them. So if it's not about the money, what specifically is it about? So let's get to these little things. And by the way, I mentioned this, but just so you know, the action step for you guys, like I said, put it on the mirror, is to say it's not about the money. And the next time you are annoyed at your spouse or frustrated or resentful or confused, ask yourself, what is it why am I feeling this way, right? And that will help you even then figure out, why are they feeling this way? Okay, so the things that we're supposed to do, if it's not about the money, here's what it's about. We found 5 factors, and we're not going to be able to get to them all. We'll try to jump into 2 or 3 of them just to give you a starting point. The first factor that is often running under the surface, and by the way, this is the one that is the most responsible for the daily friction, is that we don't realize we are not valuing what our spouse is valuing in that moment. And all of us know we're different people, but for some reason, we just don't translate that in our head to thinking that, they may legitimately care about something different than I do. And that's okay to have a totally different feeling about how things work. Here's just a couple of pictures to just illustrate this. There's so many different ways this plays out. But one person, remember how Jeff said that we have the shoulds? This is just the way it should work. Well, one person might in their mind be thinking, our money needs to go to a big vacation every year where we're, off, on a cruise, or we're hiking or we're kayaking down rivers in Europe or whatever. And that's just getting that week or 2 weeks away. That's just, of course, what we should be aiming for. Whereas the other person in the couple might be intimately thinking, oh my goodness, what we should be aiming for is to budget our money so that we have these connections every 2 weeks and we have a romantic date night where we just get away and have a really nice dinner and talk. And
which involves spending money on a regular basis.
Neither of those 2 things is right or wrong. They're just very different. And there's so many different ways that plays out. Now, and it's interesting because we feel like our way is right. Do you want to tell them about Kurt Thompson? What he's...
Yeah, there's I was listening to a podcast probably over a year ago, and it was by a Christian psychiatrist. His name's Kurt Thompson, and he has a kind of specialty in neurobiology, neuroscience. So he studies the human brain, and he said that, most people, when it comes to making decisions, most people will say that, I use my intellect. I evaluate all of the conditions, the situation.
Figure out what makes sense.
And I make the decision based upon that. And he said, what I can tell you from how the human brain operates is that is exactly wrong. Rather than figuring out what makes sense, we make sense of what feels right. That's what our brain actually does. So we have a feeling about what something should be, what some solution should be, what some answer should be. And then we kind of back into it by justifying it. So it feels right to us, so we make sense of what feels right. And that's what we do oftentimes with money.
And now the key is recognizing that in most cases, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong. There are two different values. Now, there are exceptions to that. If somebody has a gambling addiction, for example, so, 100 people objectively looking at that would say, okay, there's a right or wrong there. But in most cases, 100 people looking at a date night versus a vacation, spending structure, there's no right or wrong. And so one of the things, let me give you an example of the way this often works with one of the types of values differences that gets in the way in a lot of marriages is in most marriages, there is someone who is more comfortable spending money than the other. Now, that's not 100%, but in many cases, even with two savers, you have somebody who's a little more comfortable spending money
than the other.
And so for me in our marriage, I'm more the one who's comfortable spending money, and he's more the saver planner type.
I grew up in a farming community. You plant, and then at some point in the future, you harvest. And that future might be 30 years.
And that's okay.
It's okay.
Whereas I'm more like, God gave us stuff to enjoy today. And he is a good father who wants his children to have good gifts and, not be crazy about it. But that's part of what I value. Interestingly, Jeff actually came to me right after the shutdown when the pandemic shut everything down last March. And for us in our ministry, a lot of our revenue where we pay our staff, et cetera, comes from speaking engagements, which were all shut down. And suddenly we lost a huge chunk of our revenue. And we had been practicing trying to talk to each other about this stuff. And to his credit, Jeff came and he basically said,
I got to tell you, Shanti, I'm feeling a little bit of resentment right now. I've been thinking about, last year when we went out to eat all those times, or when we took that family vacation to Disney World. If we hadn't done those things, we'd have thousands of dollars more in our bank account right now. And it really could come in kind of handy. And so that's kind of where we left it. She took it well, understood what I was feeling. And then a few days later, several days later, I was able to think and process through this. And I eventually came back to her and I said, you know what? I still was struggling with the resentment, but I got to tell you, I was looking at it from I think, not the correct perspective. Instead, when I'd always seen you saying, let's go out as a family to eat, or let's go to Disney World this vacation, I looked at those things really as kind of a net cost, a net expense. And you were looking like they're more of a net investment, an investment in our family, an investment in memories, in our relationship. Connection. And so now here we are, stuck, all four of us,
in quarantine,
on top of each other, and we like each other. And we've laughed about those things that we did at Disney World. And we've laughed about the, whatever, the meals out, all of those things. And they really were not a net expense. They were a net investment.
And that, his willingness, and here's what I'm going to tell you here, his willingness to go, oh my goodness, Shanti is valuing something different. And there is value to that, even when you disagree. Like, Jeff, I think you said something like, instead of going out to eat, we could have done picnics in the park. That still would have been free. Family togetherness for free. But he tried to value and understand what it was that was in my heart. And as a result, it lowered all of the defensiveness. Those of you who have ever had to have these conversations know that sometimes there's that defensiveness. It lowered all of that defensiveness. And I was so much more able then to be able to have the conversation that I knew you wanted to have, which is, hey, let's talk about the austerity plan now that we're stuck and shut down and all of our revenue has gone away for a while. And so
that was great.
And that's what we want to mention here. There are so many different types of values. And I wish we could get to all of them, but this is an example for you to be able to say, is it valuing time versus money? Is it valuing this versus that? What are the things
flexibility
that are flexibility versus planning? What are the things that matter to you? And recognizing that the other person's value is truly just as legitimate as yours, even though it may not feel that way.
That's right.
So there's the action step. Even if you disagree with your spouse, which you may still disagree, show that you want to understand what they value. Show that you want to honor it. Okay, next topic, the next factor of the 5 is we don't realize that deep under the surface, our spouse is dealing with some very different fears and insecurities than we are, and they are being triggered by money. And even worse, my attempts to make my fears feel better are going to actually make my spouse's fears worse often. The example, should I give them the cliff example?
Yeah.
Really quickly? So basically, think of it like that kind of gut level, almost irrational fear that comes if you have a fear of heights and you're standing on the edge of a cliff or someplace really high. I have that. Some of you may not, but it's this very irrational thing, like it's going to suck me over and I'm going to fall and die. Even though, I'm standing there, it's fine, but I feel like that's going to happen. So what do I do when I have that instinctive fear? Is I try to back away from the edge, right? I do something that makes me feel better and get further away from it. Well, it turns out that actually, statistically, most money stuff is not gender related. There's no differences between men and women in spending versus saving, for example. But this is one of the exceptions. It turns out that men and women tend to have 2 different sets of these kind of cliff fears. And ours feels so real. And it's kind of like, for the other person. It just doesn't bother them. Whereas for them, it's something else that feels so real. And we don't kind of get it. So for men, the cliff tends to be this one overwhelming thought, which is, am I going to be able to provide for the family? Like that cliff is always looming, even if it's in the back of your mind as guys. I can't remember what the numbers were. It was 70-something% of men, 78% or something of men who said that this is just always kind of there, hovering. And so they try to back away from the edge, make themselves feel better by working a lot of hours or always being available to the boss or
putting enough away in case something bad happens.
Exactly. Whatever that is, it's an attempt to stay away from that edge. And the problem is that effort often takes them away from their wife, their family. They're not quite as available.
Whose fear tends to be
the reverse. The woman's fear tends to be, are we okay as a family? Are we happy? Is everybody feeling loved? Is everybody feeling together and close? And so
it's the relationship.
It's the relationship that they're worried about. And not as much, even though women are just as likely to be concerned about money, but that sense that our relationship actually could get distant. That's actually a real thought in her head. Whereas for the average guy, it's like that just doesn't feel like as much of a danger, really. And so a woman will instinctively want to do things to create togetherness, which is more likely to involve spending money, not always, but more.
Going and having dinner if I'm working late at an office.
Yes,
meeting me somewhere.
Let's bring the kids and go meet you at the deli near the office. And that's great, but
what I'm thinking is, great, now we're spending another $35 or $40 for dinner.
Or 50 or 70.
Or that, and I need to work some more.
And so my attempts to make my fears better, my attempts to soothe those and stay further away from that edge, make my spouse's worse. And you can see how that works on both sides. The key here, truly, is to be able to have this conversation and go, is this real? Because for most men are trying to show their wife and their kids how much they love them by providing. And that is a very real motivation.
Can I give the story about
Go for it.
The doctor's visit?
Yeah, do it real quick.
So this might help kind of put an example or an illustration so you guys can grasp kind of how this works differently for us as men and women. So when our kids were little bitty, let's say it's 10 o'clock at night and those little feet come into the bedroom and one of those little kids says, Mom, my throat's sore. So immediately, what are you thinking?
So I'm thinking, oh my gosh. And every woman will understand what this feels like. You know how all of a sudden all the windows pop up in your head? like
on a computer desktop.
Like on a computer desktop. Like, okay, so
now 10 things
now
to
I've
do.
got to figure out, okay, take them to the doctor because I can't send them to school if they have strep throat. And so I need to get a strep test. And if they have to stay home, then that means that I got to figure out somebody to cover me at work, or I've got to reschedule the meeting, or like all this stuff comes up. And so I want to take them to the doctor to see if they have a strep throat, and so, or whether I need to worry about that or not.
And in my case, I'm thinking, well, we've got kind of a wonky insurance policy. It's all going to be out of pocket. So we're going to have this doctor's visit, which is going to be $150. It's going to be out of pocket. And 8 out of the last 10 times that they had strep, they had a sore throat and they had a test, they didn't have strep. So I would go to Shanti. I would say, look, pioneer children didn't run off to the doctor every time they had a sore throat.
And they died.
Yeah. Okay. So I still haven't worked out a really better example for that. But the truth was, when Shanti would take the kids to the doctor and the test would come back negative, I'd actually be annoyed. And it wasn't like I would have been happy if they would have had strep, because then I would have gotten our money's worth. It wasn't that. It was the fact that it felt that taking them to the doctor didn't solve the technical problem of the sore throat. What solves it is 2 aspirins and
wait a couple of days.
So that's what was annoying to me. And that was because what I thought we were buying with this
$150,
this $150 was the ability for us to know whether or not they had strep. And what Shanti was paying for was peace of mind. She was willing to spend $150 just to know that they don't have strep, so therefore
they're okay.
Her next several days are fine.
And that's just one example of the way that all these things work, and learning what's going on underneath the surface makes all the difference. Now, we have to wrap up, but let me just mention the action step for this one, which is, if you will actually try to understand some of these things, and you may be flipped, right? This is most men and most women, but there's about 20% of couples that are flipped on this. So the key is to empathize with whatever these cliff fears are, even though they may be different from yours and they may not seem like they should be that worrisome, just to really kind of walk a mile in your spouse's shoes, so to speak. Now, just to close this up, let me just mention we're going to have to sort of cut it off more than I would have wanted, but be aware that there's another topic that is worth asking yourself, which is, are we one team in money? And have we, maybe because some of these tensions get in the way, kind of pulled ourselves a little bit apart from each other
and somewhat institutionalized it.
And do money separately, like your paycheck goes into your account, my paycheck goes into my account.
You don't tell me what to do with it.
And I can do what I want. We may not think that we have that sense of sort of you and me instead of we, because God wants us to be we. We may not think we have that, but even like asking yourself, like, do you maybe even pull the Amazon package off the front step before your spouse sees it? And those kinds of questions will help you understand that. Now, the resources that we just want to mention really quickly is, if you're interested in trying to get a start on this, there's a free assessment on our website at thriveandloveandmoney.com. And it'll actually help you It takes 5 minutes. It's really quick. And it'll actually help you kind of identify some of these things.
Take it.
Each of you take it separately and just kind of say, where are we starting and what do we need to talk about? And if you're interested, I know Pastor Matt was showing an example of the workbook and the book, and we also have a course at thriveandloveandmoney.com as well that you can watch and sort of talk through these things, just a few minutes every day to go through this. So
that's great.
That's our starting point for you guys. And maybe your very first question as you end here is this one, which after we're done tomorrow, some other time, ask each other, what one thing could I do that would make it easier for you to talk about money with me? So that is our encouragement for you guys tonight.
Stop share.
And I am trying to stop the share on my screen.